This is Generous Theology, and for this episode, Chuck and Brock are taking a look at Chapter 20, The Nature of Change, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
Yeah, I agree. These are not easy to encapsulate in an intuitive form. And perhaps in talking about it the way I've talked about it, perhaps I've oversimplified. I'm just searching for something intuitive, and maybe that intuitive shape is helpful. Think in the formula fluens, if you have, let's say I'm looking at a movie of a bird flying, like a hummingbird. The hummingbird's wings beat so very quickly that the human eye cannot really distinguish the motion in them. However, a high-speed camera can take these very high detailed resolution images where you can actually slow it down. You can go through a sequence of frames with a small enough time differential so that you can actually see the wings in their successive position. And so in that sense, the movie is independent of the bird. The bird happens to be the subject of the frame of the scene in the movie, but the movie is in itself completely independent of that subject. It could have just as easily been something else, and there was nothing particular about it's orthogonal, maybe is a good word. There's nothing about the bird that is affecting the camera that is recording its motion. It could have just as easily been the camera taking a picture of somebody pouring a beverage out of a bottle and into a glass. So that independence is there. And then you have to ask, is there a connection? Does the bird govern that understanding of reality? And in this example, it seems like it doesn't, but there's another way here in which that might be the case. So the fluxus formae, which is the other major opinion that came out of the thinking here, is the idea that change is not the form acquired, but is the flux of that, as the author puts it, the flow, the process, or the road towards this actuality or this perfection. And so here you have, imagine conceiving of the film as an organic whole in which the camera plays its part. And so it's the whole system that contains the bird, that contains the camera, that contains everything associated with the production of that movie and those movie images. And so maybe another approach is this. A really interesting debate in science today is, does gravity exist? And when I was back in school, I was taught this sort of Platonic understanding of gravity. Gravity was this non-corporeal field that existed in space and time. And within this field, gravity would act upon objects within the field that had certain values of mass in certain defined ways. And that's how I came to think about and understand gravity. But now there are some people in the physical sciences who are considering maybe there is no incorporeal, quote unquote, field of gravity. Maybe there's only the objects themselves and not this exterior, formless, incorporeal thing acting upon them. And that's no easy thing to pull apart. And this is going to have a lot of interesting impacts when we move into the next chapter on soul and body, and like the mind-body dualism, or the dualistic view of humankind, for example. And so that's how this developed. And again, these were very important formulaic understandings, but they also didn't quite get us there. And so you have interactions between folks. So Occam is a big name during this time. We have other folks, Buridan, Albert of Saxony, Orim. Help me with Orim. I looked up on the pronunciation, and apparently in the French, it sounds something like Orim, Ochem. Maybe that's the better way of doing it. So maybe a French speaker can tell me how Nicholas Oresme says his name, if I were to literally transliterate the letters the way it appears here. I think it's Ohorim. These thinkers, this is where you get the how many angels can dance on the head of a pin scenarios, because you're trying to understand the world in the light of these grids, but you're also not sure if you're using the right grids themselves. So let me throw that over to you, Chuck. How do we know which grid to use?
Yeah, no, and there's a sense in which that's right, where you're arguing both about the grid to use to understand it, as well as what are the implications of that. And that does make it very complicated. I would say that one of the things that struck me and again, there was a part where I'm reading through the Times and trying to pick up on some of the real world effects that these different ways of thinking have. But as I was doing that, the reflection led me to think back to my college days when the philosophy course that I took, our professor pointed out how there is some Christians structure the world into that you need to understand two things about things that you're thinking about. One is its structure. So what is it made of? What is its nature? What a box has a particular type of structure. It's made out of certain elements. It has a certain kind of shape. A gun has a certain kind of shape, and it's made out of certain metals, and there's different ways that it operates, and that gets a structure. And that we also then have to also think about its direction. And direction, of course, is always seen in terms of the antithesis, either for God or against God. But of course, that gets to be, complicated, because then there's more to direction than just that. But direction gets to things like purpose. And so a box may have a purpose and a direction in which that structure naturally takes it, but there can be cross purposes, and do they work well with the structure? And it did strike me that there was a part of me that thought, is the difference between the forma fluens way of thinking and the fluxus formae thinking on the one side really focusing on structure, and on the other side really focusing on direction? And is the answer really that we need to do both? That to really understand the world, when we think about objects, when we think about things, we have to think of both structure and a direction in order to really have an understanding. And so there was a sense in which, as I read through this, and I have to say again, as this chapter was really interesting, a lot of good stuff there, but also a lot of questions that I ended up with still at the end of it. But I wondered whether there was a sense in which, again, the fluxus formae and the forma fluens way of thinking were almost too much in this. We have to have one way of doing things. There has to be a single unified theory, and that perhaps an alternate way of thinking of these things would be to consider them both. Consider the structure and the direction. Consider, Plato might say, consider both the form and the actuality as well as the form. And maybe, and I don't know, that's where I was heading as reading the end of this chapter, is that perhaps now what we were getting is people like Occam and Burden and Oram, were they so focused on one or the other that maybe there's a sense in which we need to go beyond that to both structure and a direction.
Oram and Buridan both deserve more time than we're able to give them here for today. And unfortunately, I think we're going to move on next time to the next chapter. I just wanted to point out that those two thinkers are at the end of the chain. So we've pulled on the chain. The chain is anchored. We've got two chains that sort of branch off. One chain following largely from Aristotle, and the other one following largely from Plato, or Christian, or Jewish or Islamic. I don't want to leave them out, but these two thinkers are at the end of the links. So they're worth going into. They're worth studying in more detail. We unfortunately just ran out of time. Maybe we're saved by the bell because these are quite sophisticated thinkers, and to do them right, we need that. So maybe the bell saved us, Chuck.
Yeah. Saved us by basically we didn't have to answer all these really difficult questions.
And that was the whole point.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful chapter. We'll continue into the next one. But you know what? The next chapter is going to work on a lot of these themes. So in one sense, we're still going to have to face the issues just in another different dimension next time.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there's a sense in which I'm glad that I was able to read the next chapter this past week, because I think it did add to even how I was thinking about the change chapter. And I think there is a sense, especially for Christians, because we do think about soul and body and those issues as so important, and we reflect on those things, that to Christians, I think it may actually be a little bit easier to dive into some of these differences between these ways of thinking in this area, because we're used to that. Whereas when we think of change, we think of it a little bit more abstractly. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to that.
The battle continues. Next session, my friend. We'll wrap it up here for today, but boy, what a pleasure talking about really interesting subjects with you. Thank you.